place that we live in over there is called Raw House. It was one of those small summer resorts in Muskoka. There were many of them in those days. They all seemed to have red roofs, you know. They're like Windermere House, and they're painted white. And this boat was used to ferry the guests because the steamers wouldn't go all the way down to Arthurlie Bay over here. It was too far and there wouldn't be enough people. So the reason that the boat has the name of the resort on it was that people were told to get off the Sagamo or whatever it was and look around on the docks till they see a boat that has the name. And that was the thing. So this was the boat that was used to bring people, and it would always come through the cut, you know, the canoe cut, or cut, it's really. And it would bring people through there. And I have photographs of it in the 1920s, loaded up in the bow with bags of flour and God knows what all stuff, you know. My aunt owned the boat, and I don't know what she paid for, probably about $575, I think was about the going rate in those days. But it's the deluxe model, and you can put 18 people in them according to the picture, you know. Yeah, but you can put a lot. And I remember as a boy when she was a very old lady, she would take us once a year on a good run. We'd go down Lake Muskoka, we might go to Bala, or we'd go down, say, to Beaumaris. And there were all kinds of places where you could have a shore lunch in those days, and that was wonderful. And I remember I was the guy, because I was about 10 or 11 years old, I always had to take the front seat out and bail the boat, because by this time it was getting pretty leaky and old, you see. And my brother and I were instructed to kneel on the front seat and watch out for rocks. So that's how you keep the kids occupied, you know, so they've got a job to do. And I also had to put the gas in the tank, and I had to, and the gas, I still have the jar. It was one of those sort of a vinegar jar, you know, 1 gallon jar, and I still use that. And it's handy because it's glass, and you pour the gas in it, and if there's any water in the gas, you can see it before you dump it in the gas tank. So I still use that, you know. And we'd strain gas through an old felt hat. So we'd go and have this lunch. We'd have the whole boat filled with aunts and uncles, all the wicker hampers full of goodies, and we'd have a really nice lunch. And then about mid-afternoon, everybody decides, day like today, you know, decide it's time to come home. So we'd start coming home, and you get about to the mouth of the Indian River, the south end, and the engine would start running slightly unevenly. And, you know, the kind of the exuberant mood would kind of change, because there were kind of clouds on the horizon, which usually did appear after a little while. And I remember going on these trips year after year, and I don't ever remember one trip where we actually made it all the way home without somebody having to row the last half mile or something. And I remember my aunt would look very worried, and she'd fiddle with the controls, and sometimes that helped and sometimes it didn't. But, you know, there's probably batteries going dead, you know, just slowly and things like that. So I fell in love with the boat when I was a kid. I used to sit in the boathouse and just watch it for hours. The noise of the rudder squeaking away, and there's a lot of damage on this side of the boat from nails that used to hold tires onto a dock, and the tires all fell off, but the heads of the nails were still there. So along about the middle of the boat on this side, there's an awful lot of little dash marks from the nails, you know. But I was a little kid, and I thought that was the way it was supposed to be. You don't realize those things when you're young, you know. So anyway, I've had to live with, you know, trying to prevent them from getting any worse. And there are cracks along here. That's from the years when there was no boathouse, and the boat had to be kept turned over upside down on a rock. So you'd roll it over in the gunnel, and that would crack the plank there and so on. But these floorboards are not the originals. They were put in about 1930 by the Port Carling Boat Works. Somebody smartened up and realized, well, dippies all leak, and therefore you have to have your floorboards raised up a little bit. You'll see that there's a little bit of water in the bilge now, and that's all correct. Well, this boat was so bad and so derelict, it was gray. I mean, there was no color, no varnish left on it at all. The idea was to tow this boat out after we got Pinafore going, and it's an earlier boat. It's like Beijing, hand start. So we put a lot of rocks in this boat, took the engine. Everybody saves the engine, you know, because it's pretty. And we watched it going down. And Nora and I were there in Pinafore, and this thing was getting lower and lower in the water. And I thought, you know, this is my family history. I can't let this happen. So we threw all the rocks out of the boat and towed the thing back to shore, and by that time it was getting up close to the gunnels. And so that's when I decided I had to restore this, because it was the family boat. And it wasn't the same as the other one, and you know the differences. But one thing that was interesting, Hurricane Hazel hit Muskoka October 15th, 1954, and there were a lot of winds and so on. It tore open the door of the boathouse that this was in, and the boat got away, and it vanished. And my aunt went out the next day, and she went all around the shore to try to find everything that had floated out of the boat. So she got the oars and nearly all of the seats. The front seat back still original. The seat bottom is not, because there were probably tools in it, and it probably, you know, sank or something, but it wasn't in the boat. The boat was at the bottom of Lake Rosso all winter. Nobody knew where it was. Stan Carr was out canoeing in the spring, paddling along out in front of Gibson's place, which is about, you know, a tenth of a mile from our boathouse. And he looks over, and there it is. It's down there. It's in 20 feet of water. So they somehow got hooks under the thing and brought it up, and they had to drain the water out of the engine, of course, and get a new coil and new battery and new gas, and away it went. So, but that was probably the reason why all the varnish came off, because it spent the entire winter at the bottom of the lake. So it's never missed a year on the lakes. It's always been running every year. So that's kind of a fun story.
Baisong is a 1920 disappearing propeller boat, so it's one of the earliest that's still going in the fleet. She's new to me. She was discovered under a cottage on Georgian Bay by John and Happy Thompson in the 80s and restored and run by them for a number of years, and I was lucky enough to become her custodian when they decided it was time to sell it. Disc-Bros, when they first started and until 1922, hadn't figured out any way to control engine from the helm seat, which is this seat just to the rear of the middle of the boat. If you wanted to start the engine, if you wanted to stop the engine, slow it down, or adjust the carburetor, you had to lean over this seat or climb into the front compartment in order to do it. So it requires a certain agility and a certain familiarity with the motor so that you don't put your fingers in the wrong place. One of the features of this boat is the top. They discovered it by serendipity when they were looking for other Disc-Pro parts. It's the only original Disc-Pro auto top left in existence as far as we know. They were advertised in the catalog for 2 or 3 years, but they added half as much again to the price of the boat as the total price, so they obviously weren't very popular. And I'm very glad I got it, because it just is a wonderful air conditioning unit. It keeps the sun off you, and it also funnels the air through in sort of a pitot tube effect. So you've got, on a hot day, lovely breeze blowing over you all of the time. The motor is a Model D, which is one of the earlier Disc-Pro motors. It's been very reliable, but It has to run well because you have to lean over the back of the front seat or climb into the front seat and flip the flywheel in order to start. It's not running well. There's not much margin for error. The improvements that were made, the rudder is not as deep as the rudder on the later boats, so that if somebody's sitting in the front seat and then the rudder comes up out of the water and it's rather difficult to steer. The other thing, device, which is the heart of the disappearing propeller boat, it's the unit into which the propeller will raise, either if a rock hits the skeg in front of it or if you lift the lever. This one is held up just by a ratchet, which obviously, or not obviously, but always is too loose or else too tight. The later boats, they put a brake on it so that it worked better. The name that John and Happy put on the boat, Baisong, is the first part of the Ojibwe name for Port Carling, based on rapids, with the rapids where the locks are now, the small locks. Gladys is a 1947 brevet dippy. After the original company went bankrupt in 1926, the patents and the patterns were bought by someone in Lindsay who built a few boats, and then Brevet purchased the patterns and built the boats until about the mid-50s. So as I said, this is a 1947 model built by Brevet. It was found by Doug Brown in about 1984, restored by him, and has been a member of the Disbro Owners Association since its inception. I purchased the boat from Anne Brown last Christmas. The idea was to see if Disbro would lend itself to repowering from gasoline engines, which are fun but a little bit cranky and hard to operate, to electricity, which is dead simple to operate. Credit for the idea has to be given to Kerry Harmon, who is an engineer by profession and who did a lot of work collecting the information on a number of boats, not exactly dippies, but dippy-like boats that had been electrified, and producing the criteria or the appropriate endurance for the boat. The idea was that she should be able to keep up with the Disbro fleet, which goes about 6 or 6.5 miles an hour, and she should be able to do that for a minimum of 5 hours. Using Kerry's numbers, we took out the St. Lawrence engine and put in this package. The motor, the controller, and the drive are all a package produced by the Electric Yacht Company in Minnesota, primarily for sailboats. This motor can be configured to run on 24, 36, or 48 volts and will produce power in accordance with that. We chose the 36 volt arrangement, and so the power is in these two batteries. They're each 100 amp hour 36 volt batteries. They're wired in parallel, so that gives you the equivalent of a 200 amp hour 36 volt battery. Kerry's numbers said that going at 6 or 6.5 miles an hour, we should be able to go for 5 hours. What we've proven is that we're getting more closer to 6 or 7 hours. And if you're prepared to drop the speed 0.5 mile an hour to 5.5, you can go for 8 or 9 hours. Installation has been a very successful one. It's smooth, it's quiet. As Paul Doddington said when he came out in it, you can hear the birds singing when it's going. We think that perhaps there's a future, not for all the dippies, but for those people who find the engines a challenge. This seems like a good solution that will keep the boats going and allow tremendous ease of operation. And you don't get your hands greasy.
I wanna linger beside that pick a melody. Got a clown at me. Got a Say what you may, but the way he plays that violin shows that he folds, that he throws his entire feeling in. Come, honey, they're
These
going
people
down, drown.
brought this out way on the 30th.
Lead me to that beautiful band. Here, this is the show, baby, to a show. I'm not complaining of it, oh no. I'm only telling you that you're so slow. I'm worth the time, so come on. Don't worry about the fare. We'll take some dinner along in first class style and eat it while we're there. I'll bet my share you'll be there all right with an appetite like a grizzly bear. Just got a slide trombone a-blowing for me. Just got old sweet cornet all blowing for me. Got a piccolo, pick a melody. Got a clarinet at me. Got a cello. Say what you may, but the way he plays that violin shows when he folds and he throws his entire feeling in. Come, honey, they're going down, drown. Lead me to that beautiful band. Yeah, that slide trombone, Mr. Southern Band. Oh, yeah, them cornets. Yeah, the piccolo, pick a melody. Yeah, the clarinet.
Was that they put all these dashboard controls all in, and that's 1922 when they did that. So in up to about 1922, you had to hand start them. But starting in 22, it was standard to have this setup, where your grease cups are here and there are lines going to the main bearings, and this allows you to operate the priming cup. So if you want to, you can actually make it breathe, or you can prime it. You can open it. That's an open priming cup. And this is the automatic prime position, where you use a little piston pump here to shoot gas through that line into the cylinder. And then when you want to go, you push that forward, and that locks into place, closes the thing off. So the starter is really ingenious. It's down in here, and it's a little ratchet mechanism, and so it turns the whole propeller shaft, propeller, and everything. So when you're pulling on that, you're revolving everything that there is to revolve. So we'll just give that a try. If I pull this out, you'll hear the ratchet. That's what you don't want to happen if your engine's running in reverse. And this is the carburetor mixture adjustment. Speed it up to do it that way. Well, I've got the propeller up right now, so I won't speed it up too much. But that's how you change the spark time. Check that the water pump is working. You can do that. So is just running off a couple of Duracell batteries, which you can't get anymore, but once they're dead, I'll put new battery in.
Did you ever see one with a foot starter?
Just pictures, and I've seen parts of the foot treadle mechanism. Imagine that launched a few people, because you had to stand up to do it.
Yeah.
And it would be like Kickstarter on a motorcycle. The one thing that I really liked about these was that they mixed your control rod here for the carburetor. It works kind of like a choke. And normally when you pull the choke out, that's rich, you know.
Sure.
But on this thing, it's hooked up the other way around. So when you want to start it, you run it rich, you push it in, and once you're going and everything's warmed up, you pull it all the way out.
Dad was running one of his dippies one time, and the drive pin on the flywheel
Oh,
fell
the
out,
key? Yeah.
and the flywheel ran up the side of the boat, went overboard.
Yeah. You know about that, don't you, Tom?
Well, I didn't lose the flywheel.
No,
but
you didn't.
I had somebody sitting in the front seat, and she suddenly went, "Ah!" It come out and hit her in the foot. She was barefoot.
Then the engine quit. Right?
Then the engine quit, yes.
This is the Model E engine, and I guess what they did when they designed, or when they were talking about different models, the very first model engine in 1916 was a Waterman, 2 horsepower Waterman. That was virtually the same as the one in Tom's boat. But the first war was on, and of course there was great patriotic fervor and all that sort of thing. Made in Canada was important in those days. So they got the A.D. Fisher Engine Company in Toronto to build the copy. Not nearly as good an engine, very roughly machined, and they worked. And apparently Mr. Fisher had a cottage on Lake of Bays, and he had a 4-cylinder one over there, but I've never seen it. So there were 2 models of that. There was a 2.5, a 2 and a 2.5 horsepower. So that would be the B and the C. And there's no difference between them. I don't know how they gained a 0.5 horsepower in 1 year, because the parts all fit. And then finally, when Disappearing Propeller Boat Company, immediately after the First War, was getting big and they were expanding, they decided that they wanted to have their own moniker on the engines. So they put out an engine called the Silent Dispro. And that's because the earlier engines had these cast aluminum mufflers, and you could hear them for miles. They were the loudest thing around. And I think particularly here in Muskoka, that people really objected to the racket that these things made. Terribly noisy engines. So they started using mufflers that they got from the U.S. Wilcox Crittenden made them. The other big difference that they did, and these were all subtle improvements, but flywheels did come off engines and people got hurt. And so this flywheel has a nut on the front end, and it has a tapered shaft like an outboard motor with an acorn nut on the end. And that acorn nut is a beautiful setup, because if you want to remove the flywheel to get at the timer, which you have to get at a lot, you just unscrew the nut about 1 or 1.5 turns, pull the flywheel forward and give it a bang with a hammer, and the flywheel comes off. It's that easy, and there's a Woodruff key in there to hold it on. So that was a great improvement, because the other ones with that other key, sometimes you can never get the key out, and if you need to replace the front main bearing or something, it's something that you think, oh dear, and you pray and all that sort of thing, that you don't wreck the engine. And especially having all the controls for timing. You can see how much advance there is there. It's huge. You know? See, there's probably over 45 degrees of advance on that. And that's because they're using vibrator coils, which have kind of a slow response rate. So You had to keep advancing it exponentially the faster you went. So there was an upper limit to how fast they would go. So, get the story of this
Guys, whenever he was in the early days, he had a dippy, and they used to put 6 or 8 people. He'd start the engine first, and then they'd all pile in.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the exhaust was on the water. So you get the 8 or 9 people.
Yeah, you had to have positive pressure on the exhaust.
When we reenacted the picture of 18 Men in a Disc Boat, it was Gockles dippy. And the trick was, you had to keep the engine running pretty fast, because if the engine ever stopped, the muffler would fill up with water, you see, to stop the engine. And then the boat would sink. So, but the problem was that there were so many people in the boat that somebody bunted the handle and the propeller went down and the boat took off with all these people in there. So it was about as far as from here, I guess to the next point, or longer, twice that far, to a dock to the east of Pinelands Lodge. And so we made everybody stay perfectly still and said, we're just going to aim it for that. Now, I was the guy that was running the engine. I was up in there, and I had to figure out with all this massive weight, 3,000 pounds in this boat, when to shut the engine off. Because I knew that once I did that, because he couldn't get the propeller back up. And we were coming in, we were making a starboard landing, which was no good, because the boat would walk to port, you see. So it ended up where we had to let the boat engine fill up with water, but we brought it over the dock, and people got out. And Bert Hurst was sitting on the bow of that boat, and he's the guy in the picture, 1920, that is in the boat, and he's sitting in the same place in the bow in the second picture. So he's the only one of the original guys who did the picture twice.
And he was the smallest.
Yeah.
He was used to the counter that way.
Said people that era, when you took that picture, they were a lot bigger than the ones that were in the original picture.
That's right.
Yeah, oh yeah, because they were all the way in the First War. They didn't get much to eat, you know. And of course they worked hard. One of the things they had to do at the factory was in the wintertime to try to start the electric motor. They'd all have to grab onto the belt and run across the room, because it was a belt drive, you know, sort of like Duke's was, you know. Line shaft.
Starter windings in it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they had fun doing that. Great story. Yeah. This piece of half round here is the only piece of wood that I could find that survived the Sagamo fire. That's from Sagamo. It's just you know, where the gangway is, where you go in the side of the boat. It was up along the top, and I hunted around on the ice the day after the fire, and that was the only piece of wood that I could find. It's partially burnt, but it fell off and fell into the lake. It fell on the snow, and I guess that put the fire out. So that's about all there is left of that thing.